The China trap. When everything is too cheap to survive, it begins with a paradox. A world where the shelves are always full, prices keep falling, and consumers feel like they're winning, yet factories collapse. Towns hollow out and entire industries disappear. A world where cheap becomes so cheap that it becomes dangerous. This is the story of how China's low-cost manufacturing reshaped the global economy, created unprecedented prosperity, and then revealed a quiet trap, one that nations are still struggling to escape. 1. The paradox of prosperity. Imagine walking through a supermarket in the early 2000s. Everything from electronics to toys to clothing was suddenly half the price it used to be. People celebrated, inflation dropped. Living standards rose. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Western factories were shutting down almost overnight. Local suppliers couldn't match the prices of Chinese factories producing the same goods for a fraction of the cost. Entire communities, once built around manufacturing, watched their economic foundations crumble. Cheap products made life easier. Cheap production made survival harder. And that contradiction would define the next 2 decades of global economics. 2. The origins of the low-cost powerhouse. China's rise wasn't accidental. It began in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping pushed the country to an economic reform. Agricultural communes were dismantled, private enterprises were allowed, and an entire nation opened itself to global trade. The world seized the opportunity. By the 1990s, China had become the workshop of the planet, armed with a vast labor force. Low wages, efficient infrastructure, and government incentives designed to attract foreign companies. But the real turning point came in 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization. This moment unlocked unprecedented access to global markets. Multinational corporations rushed in, taking advantage of cheap labor and quick industrial scaling. Factories expanded at a speed no other country could match. A new era began, one built on the promise of low cost. High volume. 3. The cost of being too cheap. In the beginning, the world benefited. Inflation in major economies stayed low. Consumers enjoyed affordable goods. Corporations reported record profits. The deeper consequences soon emerged. Local manufacturers in the US, Europe, and parts of Asia couldn't compete with prices driven down so aggressively. Entire industries disappeared: textiles, electronics assembly, basic machinery. Regions that once thrived on industrial production entered long-term decline. This wasn't simply competition. It was an economic gravitational pull. The lower China priced its goods, the more impossible it became for others to survive. And then came a second wave: Chinese overcapacity. China built more factories than the world needed. More steel, more solar panels, more aluminum, more chemicals. So much production that prices collapsed globally. A strange cycle formed. Factories kept producing even when profits vanished, supported by local governments, subsidies, and state-backed loans. The world market was flooded with ultra-cheap products. For China, it kept employment stable. For everyone else, it destabilized entire sectors. For how the trap works, economists often describe China's dominance as a cost advantage. But in reality, it functions more like a trap: economic, strategic, and psychological. The production trap. Once companies shift production to China, rebuilding that capacity at home becomes nearly impossible. Skills disappear. Supply chains atrophy. Domestic factories shut down for good. The price trap. Consumers become used to low prices. Raising them even for sustainability or national security is politically unpopular. Governments hesitate to intervene. Industries become dependent on artificially cheap imports. The dependency trap. Countries discover that essential goods from medicines to electronics components are overwhelmingly produced in China. This dependency becomes a strategic vulnerability, particularly during geopolitical tensions or crises. A world built on cheaper is better slowly realizes that too cheap comes with a hidden bill. 5. The reaction. Global pushback. By the mid-2010s, governments began to understand the consequences. The US labeled certain Chinese practices as unfair competition. European leaders warned about national industries collapsing under the weight of cheap imports. Developing countries found their own factories unable to survive when competing with subsidized Chinese production. Trade barriers rose. Tariffs increased. New industrial policies emerged. And in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed just how fragile global supply chains had become. Countries struggled to secure basic medical equipment because so much of it was manufactured in China. For the first time, the world asked a difficult question. How did we become so dependent on one country for almost everything we use? 6. Today, when survival costs more than goods, China is now facing its own challenges. A slowing economy, debt-laden property giants, shrinking population growth, and rising geopolitical tensions have changed the global picture. But one thing hasn't changed: its manufacturing power. From solar panels to electric vehicles, China produces so much such low costs that global industries cannot keep up. Factories in Europe are shutting down because Chinese alternatives are simply too cheap to match. A solar panel made in China can be sold for less than the cost of materials in the West. An electric car made in China can arrive in foreign markets at a price local manufacturers can survive. This is the China trap in its modern form. Consumers benefit, industries collapse, and governments scramble to protect their economies. 7. The hard truth in the future. The cheapness that once lifted millions out of poverty and made life easier for billions has become a double-edged sword. Cheap products create comfort. Cheap industries create fragility. And cheap competition creates dependence. The real challenge isn't China alone, it is the global system that incentivized decades of outsourcing without considering long-term resilience. Nations are now trying to rebuild their industrial bases. But rebuilding takes decades. Losing them took only a few years. The world is caught between two truths. We love cheap goods, but we cannot survive on them. It's a warning, a lesson, and a turning point. The China trap isn't just about economics. It's about what happens when the race to the lowest price becomes a race to the bottom. And whether countries can escape it will shape the future of global power.